cannabis, when I asked them, so what's going on? What are you noticing? A lot of people started to tell me about cannabis edibles. They'd say, you know, cannabis edibles are really strong. And or they'd say, boy, do I have a story for you. And so for me, that was very revealing in terms of just thinking about how the scientific process may be initiated by the questions that we ask and the stories that we hear from other people. So I thought there may be some important lessons to be learned in people's experiences and learning about what's happened to them to maybe inform public policy, to inform public health messaging. It also relates to my general interest in drug policy historically and cannabis policy in particular. So there are, as some of these journal article headlines inform us, there are lots of things that we're exposed to that in excess actually can be downright harmful, if not fatal. Water, coffee, sugar, what I'd argue are kind of the holy trinity of my existence, can be lethal in excess. But as the wise sage Rafiki told Simba in The Lion King, the past can hurt you, the past can hurt, and you can either run from it or learn from it. So I wanted to focus on how negative experiences with cannabis edibles influence subsequent behavior. How do people learn from their experiences, both in the moment, in terms of how do they manage a bad trip? I mean, that's really what we're talking about. These are bad trips. We don't really talk about them as overdoses, but bad trips. How do they learn from it? So we know that cannabis is the most widely used illicit substance in the US, but it's also important to know that there are no documented cases of a lethal cannabis overdose. You know, we have close to 500,000 people dying annually from tobacco, a very legal and widely available drug, and we have, in 2015, about 2,200 people dying from alcohol poisoning. You know, poisoning in particular, not all the other alcohol-related harms and deaths and so on and so forth. And so we're talking about a substance that is so widely prohibited historically, even though we're kind of in this moment of policy shift, but it's still seen through the eyes of being something that is associated with other illicit substances and seen as harmful. So one of the ironies of this period of prohibition that we seem to be passing through or away from, and there's lots of debate as to what moment we're in. I mean, what is this post-prohibition moment? But one of the ironies of cannabis prohibition is that certainly it promoted a lot of innovation in cultivation methods and technology and THC potency, but legalization of medical and adult use or recreational cannabis also promoted innovations in manufacturing. So what sorts of product selection and access might be available. And so we could see that with, certainly with edibles. Edibles are one category of a vast array of oral cannabis products, whether we're talking about sublingual strips or sprays or drops or tinctures of any sort. But there are compelling reasons why people would be interested in using edibles. They don't involve smoking any sort of vapor or combusted material, which can be a very important consideration for somebody whose health has been compromised in some way. They're also, of course, very discreet. You're just eating a gummy bear as you board that airplane. People don't think twice about what's going on. And the other is the longer duration of effects, okay, which could be very important for people who are using it medicinally or using it for sleep, that they can count on the effects lasting for a longer period of time. But there are also numerous concerns. There have been concerns with packing and labeling and potency and accidental ingestion. Labeling, this is a wonderful example. It just came from up north in Canada. An Ontario cannabis store mislabeled genital spray as an oral product in their first aid blender. I'm sure the late night talk shows had a lot of fun with that one. Research from a few years ago suggested that about 6% of current cannabis users were consuming infused edibles and drinks. So the point being, it's a merge, it's an artifact of moving towards more mainstream, accessible, legal cannabis, but at the same time, there are some problems. There are some problems that we're going to take a look at. And that's kind of what's inspired my research. Now, the irony, of course, of this talk is we're in a building named for, in some ways, the father of the cannabis prohibition, right? William Randolph Hearst, in his newspaper empire, played a very significant role in fabricating a lot of sensational news coverage, news stories about cannabis. And so I think it's always important to be mindful of the representations that we see in the news, in this instance about cannabis edibles. A news story coming out of Denver, kids' emergency room visits for marijuana increased in Colorado after legalization, study finds. Don't harsh our mellow dudes. So Maureen O'Dowd from the New York Times thought she'd do a little investigative journalism, travel to Denver and buy a bunch of edibles and eat them and hole up in a hotel room and then write a piece about her experience. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what might have happened there. She maybe had too much and she confined herself to a hotel room and maybe there was no room service, I don't know. Marijuana edibles pack a wallop, and then I'm not going to take the time to play it, but I'd encourage you to search on this. And this is a viral video about, the irony of this is just beautiful. A police officer who absconded with, he embezzled cannabis flower material and baked brownies with his wife and then called 911 because he thought he was dying. I mean, that's what you can hear if you listen to the story. So, in many ways, a lot of this is also, as I'm gauging from the laughter, there's a part of it that's maybe, we have a tendency to laugh. It sounds funny. Sometimes it's a knowing laughter, right, from people's experiences. But there's also an element of it, like, I can't believe that. It's just cannabis. How could people end up in an ER? But I can tell you from the research that I want to share, these experiences are so incredibly vivid and real. When people talk about believing that they're dying, they think that their life is coming to an end. They've convinced themselves that they have, that they're having a heart attack, that they have lost all complete control of their body, whatever the presenting issues or complaints are. It's very scary. It's very scary. And so, in many ways, that's why I think this is ripe for study. I've talked a little bit about, or maybe I haven't, but I will, the trouble with edibles. They appeal to children. We all know there's lots of products that are manufactured with catchy names of, candy bars and hash heath and whatever they are. And it's appealing to children, much like, in some ways the tobacco industry was producing or targeting children with cartoons and making cigarettes available and of interest. Because they have a slower onset and duration of effects, it means that people don't really know. Their reference point is taking a hit off a joint or a bong or whatever it is, and they feel the effects more rapidly because the cannabis, the active ingredients enter their bloodstream a lot more rapidly. But with edibles, it takes a lot longer to be absorbed into the bloodstream, 1 to 2 hours on average. And the effects last a lot longer. So that's both a benefit, but if you're not expecting to be feeling the psychoactive effects 8 hours later, 10 hours later, and you gotta go to work, or you gotta get in your car, or whatever it may be, that's a real problem. And then the other issue is with, again, going back to manufacturing, you have these multiple dose products that are sold. Where one thing I learned in the work that I've done is people are not able to tell what's a dose, what's a serving. And if you're like me, if you hand me a candy bar and say, no, just eat 1/4 of an inch of that candy bar, forget it, it's gonna be gone, right? Or a cup of a beverage, a bottle of a beverage, or a cookie, only eat, I don't know, a nanogram, or whatever it is, that's kind of out of my domain. But that's inspired my research. And so my research is interested in understanding what do people experience? What are the characteristics of what we call a bad trip on an edible? What leads to it? And what are the coping strategies? And then what are the consequences for subsequent behavior? Do people learn from their mistakes? And so I've got a lot here, and so I'm probably going to have to zip through a few of these. But what I really want to focus on with you is some of the stories and what people have shared. So I've got some quotes from the interviews, and then I want to jump to some of the implications in terms of thinking about how a bad trip with an edible influences subsequent behavior and what we can sort of take away from this. So I'll try not to move these too quickly, but that's just sometimes the way this works. I'm using a mixed method approach. I involved my students in my research. I had a team of 8 students doing interviews in California and Colorado. We did semi-structured interviews with 46 people, and we then used the interview data, what we learned from these interviews, to inform the design of a survey that went out online to a panel of folks who self-identified as having had a bad experience with the cannabis edible, and they responded to this panel survey. So we ended up with about 525 respondents. I will just say from the get-go, neither the interview data nor the survey data can be seen as representative, and that's a really important thing. We cannot generalize from these data to how cannabis users experience edibles or whatnot, okay? So I call them the bad trippers. And I'm just comparing my interviewees to my survey panel. Maybe it's something about people that decide to respond to surveys. There's more women. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. Median age of the bad trip was identical. The time to the onset of effects for the interviewees, those that provide that info, is about an hour, half hour to an hour for the survey panel. Duration of effects for 11 hours for the interviewees and 2 to 4 hours for my survey panel. What are the characteristics of a potent trip? Okay, so the interviewees talked about dizziness, nausea, increased heart rate, blood pressure, dehydration, incapacitation. And you could see that dizziness was the most common thing that people talked about in the surveys. And so what kinds of things were they sharing? So Cynthia was, when I interviewed her, she was 66. 66-year-old white female who was trying a smoothie that she made to deal with chronic back pain. And she talks about how she got really sick. I was vomiting. I had to take all my clothes off. My husband had to wash me, put me to bed, and my head was spinning like I was on a jet merry-go-round. It was absolutely horrendous. And I was crying, and then I'd scream. And this is an experience she had several years prior. And one of the things that struck me in talking to people is because these are such horrific experiences, they're vivid. And especially if they're vivid experiences that they retell. When bad things happen and we share them with others, we retell those stories. Luca was a 56-year-old white female, one of the few who had no idea she was eating an edible. And there was a subset of folks who did not know they were consuming an edible. And she writes about how her heart she started to panic, and her heart rate went up, and my blood pressure, and then became exponentially worse until I called 911 because it was so bad. I told them that I knew I ate edibles, so I knew it's harmless, and it's not going to kill me, and I'm going to survive. But it was I told them I think I'm going to have a heart attack. They took my blood pressure, my heart rate. She's a physical therapist, by the way. And I was kind of hyperventilating, and they told me to calm down, my breath and all that, which didn't work. Went to the hospital, they put me on monitors, gave me sedative. They gave me fluids, did an EKG. My blood pressure was 210, something like that, over 140 or something like that. She's not exactly sure. This is her recalling the experience. Duke is a 66-year-old white male. By the way, these aren't their names. I always ask folks to give me names they want to be referred to. And he told me, he said, the thing that was so scary was not being able to really control my body. Not just my mind, but my body. That's what was really weird. It used to be if you get high, get to have someone who's really powerful weed or whatever it was, you would always just feel it in your head. It's your perception of things. This was like, why can't I stand up? I really felt almost crippled by this stuff. So this notion of being incapacitated, this not being able to move, was a real issue. They also talked about a variety of different psychological effects. Social anxiety, this sort of out-of-body experience, which was really fascinating. Fear of other people, or something bad happening to them, this paranoia, this intense paranoia, and a panic attack, which manifested itself both physiologically, but also, I think, psychologically as well. What were some of the things they talked about? Matt, 22-year-old white male, described being in a car. They were going to a movie theater to go to some public space. I was like, there's no fucking way I'm going into the public space right now. You know, I'm not talking to anybody. I don't want to see anybody. I can't make any transactions right now or anything. I was just like, dude, I can't. Duke, again, talked about being at a restaurant. They're on their way to a restaurant. He says to his wife, stop the car. She said, why? I said, I can't be in the car. It's pouring out. I'm standing under this overhang. And she's like, oh my God, what is wrong with you? I said, I don't know. I'm just completely, utterly gone. I could barely stand up. I feel like my muscles, my internal organs almost are shutting down, like I can hardly stand. And I'm leaned over, I'm watching myself. I'm almost out of my body looking at myself. Like, I can't believe you're this high. I'm just talking to myself in a way going, really? You're this high? It's outside of my body, astral traveling, and just watching this, watching myself go through this, observing myself as it was happening. So it's very vivid, intense recollection of this out-of-body experience from an edible. And I will say that there was quite a bit of variation in folks. I'm going to start moving through some of these. Variation in how much prior experience they had. Incidentally, Duke and now Don had lots of experience, certainly with cannabis, and in the case of Don, lots of experience with other substances. Don said the paranoia I'd experienced as a kid about being found out was now translating to something more. But it was definitely a kind of paranoia, high level of fear. I'm not a religious person, but I was talking to God. He was curled up naked on his bathroom floor, is the scene he described. Asking, and he was with his girlfriend. They thought they'd have some edibles and go to the gym. They didn't last long at the gym before they came home. And he says, he's pleading to God, please, please take care of me. I'm going to die. I was crying and my heart was beating so fast. I just laid on the ground there weeping. This intense feeling in the moment that is what is happening to him. So, what led to this? Obviously, it's the edible. That's the initiating thing. What they consumed, what's going on in their head when they're using it, and what's the context of their use. This is a framework that Norman Zinberg developed in thinking about drug effects, and how we can think about how are people able to actually use some drugs in a controlled way. And he takes it back a lot to the mindset. So, how am I doing here? I'm probably at 20, I think.
You're just about exact.
Yeah, so let me, what I want to do, always have too much material here. So what I want to do is jump ahead a little bit to some of the implications. So, how is it a turning point when people have a bad experience? Well, people talked about how they then avoided edibles. They avoided homemade edibles. Not everybody used homemade edibles. Other people used store-bought. Other people said, you know what, I want to try it again, but I'm going to just become a more conscious consumer, right? I'm going to read the label, you know, make sure I'm not spraying the genital spray in my mouth. I'll make sure that I can trust the company, right, and that the testing is done accurately. They also learned maybe they shouldn't use it alone, or maybe they shouldn't consume 10 milligrams or whatever it is of edibles and go through TSA at the airport for a 10-hour flight, which is one of my informants shared. And for other folks, it was an opportunity actually for a deep self-reflection about, a bad experience and a bad trip opening doors in terms of them thinking about who they are and what's important to them and their priorities. So I thought this was interesting. 1 in 5 didn't plan to modify their use in any way, right? So they didn't learn from the bad experience, really. But most people did. They did plan to modify their use. How? 1 in 4, 27% said, well, I'm not touching edibles. I heard that a lot. You know, stay away from edibles. They're too strong. Another 1 in 4 said, I'm not using cannabis, which is, of course, you know, the danger of a sample size of 1. They generalize from the one horrible experience to all cannabis. They're going to avoid homemade edibles. They'll read labels more carefully, and maybe they'll ask dispensary staff for potency information, which is interesting in and of itself in terms of what it says about the belief and the investment that folks have in the knowledge of dispensary staff, that they actually know what they're talking about. You know, and I don't mean to slight anybody who works in the dispensary, but it's to acknowledge that there's not standards, there's not credentials, there's not expectations of what people know. So getting to the takeaways, and I jumped through a lot, but I think what's really important is to think about methodologically, obviously, as I said, my findings are not generalizable, but we don't really know how common a bad trip is. One of the dangers when bad things happen, when bad things happen to people, we don't understand, is that an exceptional experience or is that a typical experience? And if it's exceptional and it gets recrafted in the media and in our own consciousness as a typical, that has real implications for how we perceive the plant and edibles and so on and so forth. Another important takeaway is that nobody that I interviewed, and I assume nobody I surveyed, because I didn't meet them, experienced lasting physiological or psychological effects. That's important. Remember I said that we don't have documented cases of a lethal cannabis overdose. Okay? So when we think about these experiences, they're terrifying and they're horrible. But people are okay, they move on. They do recover. There may be some of my informants talked about being triggered by the offer of an edible. It brings back memories of this horrible experience. But I would also say another takeaway is probably more for public health professionals and also the cannabis industry, that if they're losing, certainly from an industry standpoint, if they're losing 1 in 4 users because of a bad trip, I would think they'd have a personal investment in making sure that people have positive experiences. So that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion. And,